Hi guys, Grand J here and welcome to another one of our videos. The latest Heroes and Villains starter deck has just been spoiled, so here I am to discuss what you guys are going to get in the new starter deck and look at some of the new cards that will be coming out in this new starter deck. So, for those of you guys that haven't been keeping up to date, the new Heroes and Villains starter deck will be coming out with Opus VII. It comes with two 50 card starter decks, a villain side and a hero side, so it's great for two players to get started in the game, and there's a lot of value in this deck as well as some very interesting new exclusive cards. So on both sides of the deck, so for each of the 50 card decks, there are 4 new exclusive cards, so there are 8 new exclusive cards from the starter deck in total. Each of these you will have 3 copies of, so all you need for existing players is to just pick up 1 copy of this deck and you'll have all the new cards available to you. So let's get started. The first new card to be talking about is the Emperor. It is a 2 CP backup, EX burst. When the Emperor enters the field, choose one forward an opponent controls. If you have received 4 points of damage or more, dull it and freeze it. In addition, it's got a secondary ability, Ice Dull, discard 2 cards, choose one dull forward, break it. You can only use this ability during your turn. So this card is a very interesting and very powerful card in my opinion. It screams out just absolute control card. So at a 2 CP backup, it is one of those backups that you can put in very cheaply on your first turn, even though if you play it like anywhere in the early game, you're unlikely going to get the entry ability of being able to dull and freeze it forward. But if you do play it later on in the game, there is not a bad chance of you being able to dull and freeze it forward, which is actually pretty good by itself, just on a 2 CP backup. So that's actually pretty good value, but its secondary ability is what really interests me. For Ice Dull, discard 2 cards, being able to destroy a dull forward is really strong. Even though you're effectively paying 6 CP, so in the Ice Dull, that's effectively 2 CP there, and then discarding 2 cards, that's another 4 CP, you are getting to deal with a dull forward, and of course Ice has a lot of ways to dull your opponent's forwards. This is really strong, especially for Ice decks, simply because Ice decks will progressively have more and more opposing forwards that they have to deal with, simply because they will constantly dull and freeze opponents' forwards, and then these forwards will just build up. So being able to remove or break these forwards is extremely handy for Ice decks to have, and this is actually a pretty cost-efficient way to remove them. Even though you're not getting a CP advantage by destroying your opponent's forwards, if you are destroying a forward that's 4 CP or higher, you're effectively breaking even on the cost for this backup ability, because your opponent effectively loses a card, so the forward itself, and the 4 CP they use to break it. Unfortunately, you can't pay CP for your own ability, so you have to discard 2 cards, so so you're unable to discard 1 card and pay effectively 3 extra CP instead. So this card does require you to discard 2 cards, so it is card intensive, but in a situation where you do have control of the board, then this allows you to remove your opponent's forwards, and it's a renewable effect, so it is a very strong control card. Obviously this card, I feel, falls into 2 specific archetypes. So obviously the first archetype that this card probably falls into is the Vikings deck, so a deck that runs the Vikings, as well as like typical ice package. And the reason why this is relevant is because Vikings tend to allow you to draw more cards for your deck, so it means that your hand tends to be a little bit larger, which means the ability to discard 2 cards from your hand and pay 2 Ice Dull is generally pretty easy for this deck to do. So your opponent is generally going to be a little bit more afraid to attack you, especially since if they're attacking you with a large forward, you can just block with a Viking. It doesn't really matter. Your Viking dies, you draw a card, and then they have a dull forward. Then on the following turn, you can just trade 2 cards and Ice Dull to break your opponent's forward. So it puts your opponent in a situation where they really have to consider very carefully what they're attacking with, unless they have brave forwards. In addition to this, obviously if you use any sort of dull or freeze effect, then this also just allows you to trigger off the secondary ability to destroy your opponent's forwards. So this is a really strong control card. The fact that it's an EX burst as well is also pretty handy, so whilst it won't trigger off too often, but in the situations where you do trigger it off on your 4th, 5th or 6th damage, then you do get a very nice EX burst effect as well. So when it does come in as a EX burst, there is the off chance where it is very powerful. The other deck that I think that this is going to be particularly strong for is the Turbo Ice deck. Now, typically Turbo Ice is a more aggressive deck, so you might be thinking, well, why would it run this deck? Why would it run this card? In this situation, because Turbo Ice does run copies of Jesper forces both you and your opponent to discard cards from your hand. So obviously you want to use Jesper in a situation where you don't have any cards from your hand and your opponent has cards, so you're forcing your opponent to discard in a non-symmetric situation. Obviously, this is very good in this situation because you can discard the extra cards from your hand to destroy your opponent's forwards that are dull, and then after you've got no cards in your hand, or you've cleared them all out, then you can use Jesper to force you and your opponent both to discard cards, but because you've already discarded cards from your hand, you have no cards to discard. So the Emperor actually seems very powerful to me, and I'm very interested to try it out in quite a couple of decks. Unfortunately, it does have the problem of being named the Emperor, and there are quite a lot of strong cards, both in previous sets and in this set as well, that are named the Emperor, and you're going to obviously have to choose between which forwards, or in this case, which backup you want to play, called the Emperor. But in this situation, I do think that this particularly strong card, running 2 or 3 copies of this card, potentially in a control deck, or a Vice King's deck, or a Turbo Ice deck, seems like a good fit. Next we have ULTIMECIA, and this card is a card that I'm extremely excited to try out. So ULTIMECIA is a 6-cost, 7,000 power forward, so it is quite below the curve, but when ULTIMECIA enters the field, select one of the 3 following actions. If you have received 6 points of damage or more, select up to 2 of the 3 following actions instead. Choose up to 2 characters your opponent controls, dull them, freeze all forwards your opponent controls, or freeze all backups your opponent controls. So this is a unbelievably versatile card, so it is great on both offense and defense. Obviously, on offense, you can just play it as a forward to dull 2 of your opponent's forward. So on entry, it's got relevance, even though it may not be strong as a card such as Orphan, but its other 2 options are where this card gets really strong. So for most of the games that you'll be playing ULTIMECIA, you'll probably be activating only one of the effects. If you do activate 2 effects, generally it's one of those situations where you're kind of behind on the game, but definitely it is a strong extra bonus when you are kind of on your last life. But the reason why this card is so powerful is because it is a stun card. Especially in any sort of situation your opponent taps out all their backups, you can play this card, and it basically forces your opponent to play cards on their following turn by just simply discarding cards from their hand. So unless your opponent is literally wind and they have one of the few abilities to reactivate all their backups in the form of Layap or in the form of Ashura or Diablos, your opponent is pretty much locked down to playing cards exclusively from their hand. So this is a very strong card to force your opponent to make those big plays from their hand and force them to discard cards from their hand. Obviously, this is a very good in those situations where you do have tempo or you do have ball control, and potentially I do think Ice or potentially like Ice Lightning would be a very good fit for this deck. Now, whilst the body is a little bit small, interestingly enough, its job, which is a witch, is what makes this card actually particularly a lot better. So included in the starter deck is the backup Idea from the previous Opus, where Idea has the ability to break itself to play a witch from your break zone back on the field, which does allow you to have a cheap method of playing this ULTIMECIA out, and I think it combos very well with this ULTIMECIA. So, like, the fact that you can cheat her in without paying the full cost using Idea's ability is extremely good, and I think it's going to combo very well. If you do chuck it into a, like, potentially even a mono lightning deck, I potentially see her being very good. So in a situation where, say, if your opponent has 1 forward on the field, you can play Ousted Onion Knight, blow up their forward, and you have 2 forwards on the field, and then you can break your Idea, put ULTIMECIA in, freeze all your opponent's backups, and if your opponent's all tapped out, then your opponent literally has to find a way to respond to your ULTIMECIA, your Ousted, and your Onion Knight that are all going to be attacking on the next turn, and your opponent only has cards from your hand in order to respond to your aggression. And then obviously if you then follow up on your turn with a haste forward such as Allure, your opponent can potentially be hit with 4 damage on that turn, or your opponent has to discard a lot of cards from their hand in order to play responses. And then, yeah, simply because the fact that your opponent has a lot of their backups locked up means that a lot of those big plays your opponent isn't able to respond with. So if your opponent doesn't have a large hand size, they can't play Shantota, right? Simply because you have 3 or 4 of their backups locked up. If your opponent's hand size is small, they're not going to be able to discard enough cards to cast Shantota. So this is one of those extremely powerful cards, especially when you have any sort of field control at all. So I think that this card is very strong, and the fact that it's Witch means that it can combo with the new Lightning Idea backup very well. And yeah, I'll be trying this in both a Lightning Ice deck as well as just a mono Lightning deck, and just splashing a couple of copies of her in, which are searchable with Cipher from Opus 6, as well as replayable using the Idea from Opus 6 as well. So this card is a card that I'm really excited for, and yeah, I think that this is going to be one of those very powerful cards coming up in the World Championships. Moving on to the lightning cards, here we have Garland. It is a free CP 7000 power forward. So this is the first Garland that we've seen out of fire. So this time he has been element swapped to lightning. And his ability is when Garland blocks, Garland gains plus 2000 power until the end of turn. When Garland's put from the field into break zone, choose one forward. It gains plus 4000 power until the end of turn. So a couple of very interesting things to note here. So first of all, he is a knight still, so definitely it means that if you are one of those players that really enjoys playing knights, then now you have another knight that you can splash in without having to go into fire. So now if you want to play lightning water knights or even tricolor knights but with lightning, earth and water, you have an extra knight you can chuck in. So yeah, of course with all the knight synergy between Duke Altana, which allows you to search for him, as well as Ophelia to give him additional power-ups, he's also got a pretty decent ability, right? So his ability of gaining plus 2000 power and whenever he blocks is actually pretty strong, which means that like on his base power, he is a 9000 power blocker. So that's generally pretty strong, and it's generally going to beat out anything that's 4 costs or below. So that's a very strong blocker, and this synergizes pretty well with the water lightning knights, whereas typically the water and the lightning knights are generally very good attackers in the form of Ramsel or in the form of Beatrix. They generally don't tend to be particularly good blockers. So Garland does solidify that deck up a little bit better by having a strong blocker. An interesting note about Garland's wording, it's worded the same way that Prish's wording is. So every time he blocks, he gains plus 2000 power. So if he blocks the first time, he goes up to 9000 power. And then if he like survives the attack, if your opponent attacks again and then Garland blocks again, he gets an additional plus 2000 power. So this time he becomes 9000 to 11,000. So he becomes stronger with every single attack that he blocks. And then if your opponent does happen to force him out of play or destroy him, then he gives another one of your forwards plus 4000 power. So he's a particularly strong knight. When he blocks, he becomes 9000, and if he does trade with opponent's forward, or if he does die in combat, then he can pump up the next forward, allow it to block a little bit better. And if you give a forward plus 4000 power, unless your opponent has some way to dull it, generally your opponent is going to stop attacking there. So Garland is a very, very strong blocker, and I think he's going to sit very well in the Knight's deck. And finally, we have the final card for the Villain's starter deck. It is Golbez. It's an 8 CP 9000 power forward, so it is a little bit below the curve, but it's got a very interesting ability. The cost required to play Golbez onto the field is reduced by 1 for every 5 cards in your break zone. When Golbez enters the field, choose one forward of cost 5 or less in your break zone, add it to your hand. So this card is actually a very good value card. Obviously, it's a card that becomes much, much better in the late game as opposed to the early game. So at 8 CP and 9000 power forward, you are overpaying for this, even though you are effectively getting 2 CP back because you are collecting a forward of 5 costs or less, right? Now, if you do consider that you're getting a 9000 power forward and you are collecting a forward back, generally you ideally want to be paying for this card or playing this card when you have about 15 to 20 cards in your discard pile or your break zone. That way it reduces the cost of this card to about 5 CP or 4 CP forward. So when you do consider the fact that you are getting 2 CP back on this card after you play it, this card actually becomes reasonably cost effective. So effectively it becomes a 6 CP forward at 9000 power if you already discount the fact that you are getting a card back. So for a 9000 power forward, you generally want to be paying 4 CP if you want to get value out of it, or potentially 5 CP. So that means you want to reduce its cost by about 2 or 3 CP, ideally, to get this card to a cost-efficient size. So if you can get about 10 to 15 to 20 cards in your discard pile, you're getting pretty good value on this Golbez. So typically with cards like this, these cards usually have some sort of restriction that prevents their cost from being reduced to 0. But in this case, Golbez's cost can be reduced to 0 if you can get enough cards in your break zone. That being said though, I don't realistically think you'll be getting this card's cost down to 0 very, very often, simply because you would require 40 cards in your discard pile in order to do that, and between damage and your backups and your cards in your hand and your forwards on the field, I don't think you can get enough cards into your break zone to make this card a 0 CP forward. But if you can get it down to as low as a 5 or 4 CP forward, you're getting pretty good value. So this card is actually pretty strong. That being said though, this card is a card that has effectively seen a very similar structure in Opus 2 with the Opus 2 Archfiend's Golbez. Now that Golbez can also reduce its cost to 0 as well, and has the ability to return your Archfiends back to your hand, as well as a couple of other effects as well. So that Golbez is very similar to this Golbez, although it does require you to play Archfiends in your deck. And in my opinion, that Golbez is a little bit easier to hit its restriction or to reduce its cost to a more manageable number than this Golbez in this situation. So in my opinion, this Golbez, whilst it looks very interesting, I don't think it's one of those Golbezes that I'm really excited to be trying out. If anything, I'd much more rather revisit one of the earlier gold bears, the Arching Gold Bears, before I want to try this card out. But that being said, it's not a terrible card as a one-off or two-off in your deck, especially in Lightning where you can recur this card. So if you do pitch it from your hand early, you can use the Sage later on later in the game in order to pick it up and play it for a cheaper discount, especially when you've got more cards in your break zone. Now moving on to the hero side of the starter deck. The card that we have on the front is Furion. It is a 2 CP forward at 2000 power, EX burst when Furion enters the field. Choose one forward an opponent controls, deal it 2000 damage for each forward you control, up to 3 forwards. So maximum it can deal 6000 damage if you control 3 forwards in total. Now this card does seem a little bit underwhelming, but I think that this card's value really comes from the fact that it's very cheap. It's a very cheap forward, and it does have EX burst as well. So it ticks a lot of boxes. It's just not super potent by itself. Now I think the value of this card really comes down to allowing you to trade your smaller forwards against your opponent's larger forwards and forcing your opponent to be very, very scared in those sort of situations. So if in a situation where you are attacking him with a smaller forward that's say 4,000, 5,000 or 5,000 power, and these sort of forwards are generally forwards that you've played for some sort of end-of-play ability, you can attack them in. Even if your opponent blocks with a larger forward, then yeah, your forward might die and deal their forward 5,000, 4,000, 5,000 damage. And on a 6,000 or 7,000 power forward, you can then follow up by playing a Furion, dealing another 2,000 to 4,000 or potentially even 6,000 to finish it off. And so that makes this card very cost efficient at 2 CP. Forcing your opponent to be very afraid to block your smaller forwards against their larger forwards is something that I think that Fire wants to push more towards. And I think a lot of this starter deck is really trying to help define Fire as one of those elements where your opponent has to be afraid of trading into your smaller forwards, because you can just like follow it up with smaller packets of ping. Not to mention the fact that this card is EX burst also makes it pretty relevant as well. Means that like occasionally if you do receive damage, you can hit your opponent for 2, 4 or 6,000 damage, and generally that might be enough to destroy one of your opponent's forwards or force your opponent to stop attacking where they do have the advantage. Do note that this card does count itself when it does count its forwards, so you only really require 2 other forwards to get maximum damage, as Furion does count itself. So this card I think is going to be one of those cards that you obviously have to combine with other sort of fire effects, whether it's damage amplification effects such as using Palom, or ways to deal other packets of damage such as using like Emperor Zan to deal damage while it's attacking, or other sort of similar sort of nuke type abilities. In that sort of situation, I think Furion combos with it very well. I remember during Opus 2, when I was playing Emperor Zan in my Mono Fire list, I was playing the 4 CP Furion in order to deal 4,000 damage to my opponent's forwards. Now obviously this Furion is much cheaper, and it can deal a similar or a larger amount of damage than what Emperor Zan would be dealing as well. So obviously this combos very well into the Fire archetype, and I think that this card is really going to help push Fire back into a more playable part of the metagame. So the next forward we'll be talking about is Warrior Light. It is a 2 CP forward at 5,000 power, so it is basically on curve. Its ability is if you control 4 or more forwards, Warrior of Light gains haste, and when Warrior Light enters the field, all forwards you control gain plus 2,000 power until the end of turn. Do note that in this situation, Warrior of Light, his job is Warrior Light. So if some of you guys remember from Opus 1, there was that 2 CP Fire Warrior of Light. Its job was Warrior, not Warrior of Light. So this is one of the first sort of Fire Warrior of Lights that actually happens to be job Warrior Light as well. So there is a little bit of synergy there. But this card is actually pretty interesting. This card reminds me very much of what Bart's was, the legendary Bart's, the one where the more jobs he has, the more abilities he gains. Now obviously this Warrior of Light is a smaller, more watered down version of him, but it still has some relevant effects. So obviously this card says if you have four forwards, then Warrior Light gains haste. So if you have 3 other forwards, this card gains haste, and obviously when it comes into the field, it does become a 7,000 power forward because it gains 2,000 power from its own ability. So it actually is very similar to what Bart's is in that sort of scenario. Obviously you don't have to have 3 specific different types of jobs in this situation compared to legendary Bart's. Now there are some very interesting combos that this Warrior Light brings. Now one of the first cards that come to mind is a card that we spoiled a little bit earlier, which is Aegis, which is a 4 CP 8,000 power forward, which allows you to play a 2 CP forward from your hand for free, and this card combos with that great. Now one of the guys in the comment section of that video commented, oh yeah, what would be great is if you played Aegis into Godot, which is a 2 CP forward that allows you to play another 2 CP forward, whilst also giving all you guys plus 1000 power, and then playing some other 2 CP forward like Tifa, right? Now, this card combos into this very, very well, right? So if you can play Aegis, you can then you free play Godot, and then Godot can free play Warrior of Light, which means all of a sudden you have 3 forwards on the field, right? So if you had 1 forward on the field prior to this, you can play this combo, and now all of a sudden you've given all you guys plus 3000 power because Godot gives all you guys plus 1000 power, and then Warrior Light gives all you guys plus 2000 power. And then you're attacking with a forward that you had existing on the field, and then you attack with Warrior Light, and this Warrior Light would gain Brave because of Aegis' ability, and a lot of interesting things like that as well. So, yeah, so this card, whilst by itself doesn't seem particularly too scary, I think Fire has now got enough cards to really hit this like low CP forward aggressive type deck very, very well. And this card, whilst a little bit cumbersome, it's definitely one of those cards I really want to try to build an archetype around. So unfortunately, in this game, all the heroes tend to work on teamwork and bringing each other together and requiring more cards to have stronger effects, whilst typically the villains are generally just strong all round. But that being said though, that playing combo decks or playing decks where you can build some sort of very fun, interesting archetype or interesting board state is one of those things that deck builders really, really love to do, and this is one of those cards I really, really want to try this with. So next we have Cecil. So Cecil is a 5 CP wind forward in this situation. It's 8000 power, so it's a little bit below the curve, but EX burst, when Cecil enters the field, choose up to 2 characters, activate them. If you receive 5 points of damage or more, Cecil gains plus 2000 power, and Cecil cannot be chosen by your opponent's abilities. So this is a very interesting card. So first of all, this is the first Wind Cecil that we've seen. Previously we've had Earth Cecils and we have Water Cecils, but this is the first time we've seen him under Wind. Now, being a 5 CP forward at 8000 power, he is a little bit below the curve, but when you do consider the fact that when he can reactivate 2 characters, you can reactivate 2 of your backups, effectively making him a 3 CP 8k forward, which is above the curve. But the flexibility of this card is that it allows you to choose any 2 characters. So you can attack with forwards and then reactivate your forwards, you can reactivate your backups, or you can reactivate your monsters as well. So that's a random, relevant opportunity for you to take advantage of. So in the situation where if you're, say, playing Cactuars into Dataluma, you can use your Cactuars to deal damage to Datalumas and then deal further damage to your opponent's forwards. Or then you can play Cecil, then reactivate those Cactuars and then have them ready for defense, or use their abilities again. So so there's utility in just being able to reactivate your forwards, or reactivate your Cactuars, or reactivate your monsters. So you don't always have to use his ability to just reactivate your backups to have a cheap forward. You can use it for other flexible reasons as well. And the fact that he is on EX Burst means that if you do receive damage, you can reactivate your backups to prepare you for a summon to use against your opponent, or to reactivate some of your forwards to defend against some of their further attacks. So it's pretty good as an EX burst as well. Its secondary ability of giving it plus 2000 power and being unable to be chosen by your opponent's abilities when you have 5 or more damage is actually pretty good, considering that Wind tends to be one of those elements that does want to ramp up more. So you do tend to receive some damage early in the game when you're sort of building up your resource and your opponent can play some more faster or more aggressive cards. This does set Cecil up to be quite a powerful forward. Being 10,000 power and being unable to be chosen by opponent's abilities makes him actually very resistant to a lot of things. So first of all, he just straight up becomes bigger than most forwards that your opponent can play. Generally, faster decks can't play anything that's able to beat out 10,000 power forward on just pure power alone. So your opponent generally has to use abilities or summons to deal with it. And generally, there aren't too many summons that can deal enough damage to deal with a 10,000 power forward. Any sort of burn deck is generally going to have to combine a forward or some burn in order to get over Cecil, and generally most summons won't be able to break him outright because he is a 5 CP forward and he's at 10,000 power. Pretty much the only summons that are effective against him are Alexander's or any sort of AoE type abilities. But yeah, the fact that he can't be chosen by opponent's abilities means that your opponent isn't able to use the forward type abilities that are generally on a lot of aggressive forwards to dull this guy or to get through to this guy. So this guy I think actually might see play as a 1 of 2 off in more sort of mono win sort of rampier sort of decks. And finally we have the last exclusive card of the deck. It is Y'shtola. It is a 2 CP backup wind. When Y'shtola enters the field, choose one forward your opponent controls, deal it 2000 damage, and when dull, put Y'shtola into a break zone, choose one forward, deal it 7000 damage. You can only use this ability if you control 7 more characters. So this backup I actually think is pretty good, actually. Obviously, its one weakness is the fact that it is named Y'shtola, which means that you can't play a Y'shtola forward on the field while you have this as your backup. But that being said, though, this card is actually pretty solid. So its first ability of only dealing 2,000 damage when it comes to play, this ability isn't particularly too amazing, although occasionally, especially with Wind, because you are able to play a lot of sort of early and mid-range forwards, you can allow your forwards to trade up into larger forwards by using this Y'shtola's enter play ability. So that there by itself, if you can get some value out of it if you do play your cards right. But its secondary ability of Wind Dull Break to deal 7,000 damage is actually pretty good. Generally, when you consider backups breaking themselves to deal damage to opponents' forwards, they generally don't do that much damage. If you consider Lightning or if you consider Fire, generally if you're paying 1 CP and then breaking it, you're generally only getting about 4 or 5,000 damage, or like 2 packets of 3,000 damage. But that's just like straight up not as good as dealing 1 big packet of 7,000. You can generally kill most mid-range forwards with that, so that's pretty good. The fact that you can only use it with 7 more characters is not a terrible restriction, considering that this does include your monsters, does include your forwards, and your backups as well. So it's not too difficult to get 7 characters on the field, especially if you build your deck correctly. If you do play some more monsters, or if you play some more aggressive forwards, then it's not too difficult to get 7 characters out on the field. And also, towards the later game, when you do get to your 5 backups, it's very easy to trigger this. You have 5 backups and then like 2 forwards or a forward and a monster, and it's very easy to trigger this. It also allows you to clear up some of your backup row to allow you to play some of your larger backups if you want. So you can play this Y'shtola early on in the game, and then later on when you want to play something bigger, then you can like break this Y'shtola, deal 7,000 damage to opponent forwards, which is generally going to break something anyways, and then that gives you the space that you need to play a 5th backup for something larger or more premium when you have the space or the CP to do it later on in the game. So, because of that, I think that this serves Wind very, very well, and this card's restrictions actually isn't that bad. Do note that its restriction of you can only use this while you have 7 or more characters. This only is a restriction of when you can use this ability. On resolution, it doesn't matter how many characters you have. So, on resolution, if you no longer have 7 characters, or if your opponent destroys some of your stuff, it doesn't matter. It will still deal the 7,000 damage to your opponent, or to any forward, actually. So yeah, so this card is pretty solid. I like this card. The only problem with it is that Wind has a lot of powerful 2 CP backups. I think most elements at this stage have a lot of powerful 2 CP backups, and it's going to be really difficult to decide which 2 CP backup I'm going to take out to put in a copy of Y'shtola. But that being said though, this card is not a bad card, and I definitely do recommend you guys trying it out. And now to finish this video off, I'm going to put up the deck list for the 2 decks on screen. So first of all, we'll start off with the villain side deck list. So here it is. Now this deck list is exactly everything that you'll get in the villains half of the starter deck, and this deck comes with a lot of value here. So a couple of things to note, that there are legendaries included with these starter decks, and yes, that is right, there are 3 copies of legendary Genesis in this starter deck, and there are 3 copies of legendary Amon. So both of these are particularly chase legendaries that were printed quite a while ago, so they're a little bit more difficult to get now. Amon has definitely fallen out of favor a little bit in more recent times. Definitely during the Opus 2 metagame, he was a highly desirable forward. But now, like, he is a little bit more difficult to get now. And here we have, in this starter deck, you can get 3 copies of Amon. And Genesis, probably the best ice forward in the game. Particularly hard to get. It's really hard to get them off other players because everyone's already got their copies and they don't want to trade them away in case they want to play ice. He is extremely strong, and you can get 3 copies of him in this starter deck, so it's a very, very cost-effective way, and I like how Square Enix is reprinting some of these more expensive legendaries, especially after they've been in the metagame for quite some time, in order to allow some of the newer players to get some access to these older cards. And finally, the villain starter deck also comes with 2 copies of Shadowlord, which is a legendary. It's a handy little legendary to have, especially against certain matchups such as Ice, or against Scions. It's not a particularly money chase card, but the fact that you get 2 copies of this in your starter deck is actually a nice little bonus itself. Now moving on to the hero side of the starter deck, here is the deck list on screen. So in this situation we have a little bit less value than the villain side, but that being said though, we still get some decent value. So we have 3 copies of Legendary Vivi. Now this card is a very powerful card, probably one of the stronger, more playable fire legendaries in the game right now, and probably one of the more strongest fire forwards in the game. It comes in and deals a large amount of damage to your opponent's forward. The deck also has 3 copies of Fat Chocobo, which by itself isn't a particularly chase money card, but it opens up a lot of fun, interesting casual decks for you to play with. And considering how most Chocobos are commons, It allows you to play a more casual deck if you want to take out your fat chocobos and play with other stuff as well. So this starter deck is a great way for players to get into the game. It's got some strong cards and it has some reprints of some very useful legendaries. And if you want to take this deck apart, and if you want to play some other decks or build other stuff, this is a great tool for you guys to get in with it as well. So overall, I'm very impressed with this new Heroes and Villains starter deck. Do note, because this starter deck comes out at the same time as Opus 7, and because the new starter deck exclusive cards have been numbered Opus 7 at the bottom in their serial codes, I do believe that these cards will be available as foil variants in those booster packs as well. I don't believe you can get these starter deck exclusive cards as non-foil variants in booster packs, but if you open Opus 7, typically in past situations we have been able to open foil variants of starter deck exclusive cards in that relevant set. So if you don't want to buy this starter deck, which I don't understand why you wouldn't because there's so much great value in it, you can open up some of these exclusive cards in those starter decks as well. Or if you want to foil up your deck, that's an opportunity for you there. But what do you guys think about these new starter deck exclusive cards? Are you excited for these cards? What are some ideas that I might not have sort of talked about that you guys want to try out? Do let me know in the comment section below. I do respond to as many of you guys as possible. Do let me know what you think of this video format. Do you guys enjoy it? Do you guys think I should change it back to a previous video format? Anyways, I hope you guys enjoy. Until next time, Grand J out.